absolute pleasure to moderate a session on an issue which is so pertinent and so urgent in our times. And we have an esteemed panel which actually needs no introduction for anybody working in this space. On this panel on 21st century skills, where we speak about four successful work transitions, we build on some of our research insights from an ongoing research study on the skills and deliberate as to how must we understand these skills and how can we bring these to learners. So let me quickly start by introducing who we have today. We have with us today Sweetie Thomas, a post-her MBA in finance. Sweetie started her career with HDFC's real estate focused private equity fund. Sweetie has worked across both the investment and investor relations team for almost 5 years. Transitioning to social sector around 5 years back, she's been part of the H.T. Parekh Foundation's programs team managing grants across the education, skilling, livelihood, and disability sectors. Welcome, Sweetie. On the panel today, we have Shri B. Kalyan Chakravarti, Principal Secretary in Education, Government of Assam. Mr. Chakravarti is a BTech from IIT Chennai, MBA from IIM Ahmedabad, and Bachelor of Law from Osmania University. He's held several important positions in the Government of Assam and Government of India, holding the additional charge of Secretary, Environment, Forest, Science and Technology Department. He's represented several governments as also Government of Telangana at COP21 Paris with an event on clean energy ministerial at Beijing, China. Mr. Chakravarti has also implemented World Bank AACP project, which improved livelihood parameters. Very welcome to you, sir. We also have with us Dr. Akanksha Bapna. Dr. Akanksha Bapna has worked extensively on K-12 education, bridging the gap between practice, policy, and research. She has extensive experience in experimental research design and measuring impact across India, Nepal, Tanzania, USA, Colombia, Italy, and Netherlands. And her expertise has been applied to research designs and evaluations for organizations such as Google, the Pearson Group, the British Council, as well as the Lego Foundation and the state governments. She holds a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Cambridge and a master's degree in international education policy from Harvard University. Welcome, Akanksha. We also have with us Sucheta Bhatt. Sucheta Bhatt is the CEO of Dream a Dream, an organization working towards empowering young people from vulnerable backgrounds to overcome adversity and flourish in a fast-changing world using a creative life skills approach. She's also an advisor to many young women, social entrepreneurs, and nonprofits in India. She's a highly trained facilitator of the Arc of Transformation approach and arts-based pedagogy that can create a mindset shift in young people and adults to empower them to make more meaningful choices for themselves and their ecosystem. Welcome, Sucheta. Very happy to have you here. We also have Abhishek Gupta. Abhishek Gupta has spent 22 years working with development and corporate sector. Presently, he works at UNICEF as COO Yuva Generation Unlimited. Prior to this, he was the advisor to Deputy Chief Minister of Government of Delhi on skills development and higher education. He's also worked with McKinsey's social initiative, Building Lifelong Employability, and Hole in the Wall Education Limited, who has worked for unemployment youth and underprivileged young children. He holds a management diploma from Indian School of Business and lives in New Delhi with his wife Sarika and 2 children, Palash and Kushi. Welcome all of you. Very happy to have you here. Now, just a brief context on the panel itself. For over a few decades now, and it's been quite some time, that we have been speaking in the sector about 21st century skills. Our economy has been changing. It has been in a flux recently. Technology has transformed the way we live. But the changes are far more radical than to just say it's because of technology that our lives are changing. Creativity is really the new mode of operation. Going back as far as 2011, LinkedIn had released a survey which said that most number of people actually identified themselves as creative people just showing how important the skill creativity is in the economy today. We also know that the future is going to be disruptive. We're already in one disruption for now, and it's not going to be an easy world to inherit. If that's one part of the story, the second part is also that creativity and reaching full human potential, collaborating, has also been Dewey's call. Connection, play, reaching absolutely full human potential, the idea of flourishing has been Aristotle's call, for which 21st century skills is helpful for. But can we see these skills in isolation? Or is it the change in subjectivity of a child that we want to bring in through these skills? One where the child wants to be, is free and to unleash really the creative potential that we all have as humans. We're going to deliberate on a little of these nature of these skills and how we can look at bringing them to learners. So let me jump straight to the panel. And my first question is to Abhishek. Abhishek, my first question to you is, there is no way we can really unsee the current disruption, the pandemic. And what are the changing skills that you see, or what are the top emerging skills that you see during the pandemic today? And what's emerging as top? Abhishek?
Thanks a lot. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks, Quest team, for inviting me here. Very topical conversation, and happy to bring in some of our perspective to this. Maybe I can take a quick step back to say, talk a little bit about, since your question sort of emanates from pandemic, Yuva is, Yuva as a incubated organization within UNICEF is all about bringing young people to the center of change. And around 3 months back, when the second wave of COVID started raging, we launched a campaign called Young Warrior that basically called on young people to take small actions to fight against COVID. Things could be register your family and community for vaccines, fight the myths like vaccine can cause impotency or can kill people, or ask them to do small things like make a mask, etc. This campaign led to 5 million actions from young people in 3 months' time. And encouraged by that thought, we started thinking about why don't we respond to the education emergency as well, and started speaking with more and more young people. Before I answer to you, what could be those life skills, I want to tell you a little bit about what we heard from them. Verbatim, in many of the conversations, things were like, online lectures कुछ समझ में नहीं आ रहे हैं और बहुत ज़्यादा पढ़ाई हो रही है. लॉकडाउन में हम बहुत सारी चीज़ें कर रहे हैं और घर पे होने से बहुत डिस्ट्रैक्ट हो रहे हैं. हमें आसपास कोई पढ़ा लिखा नहीं है जो हमें लाइफ के बारे में बता सके, हमें गाइड कर सके. We also found that the conditions were something like this, that daily chores were constantly interrupting the young people. Space was constantly shared with family through the day, a small space. There was no teachers to guide. Typically, there was a shared phone in the house, or there was none. In the worst case scenario, you couldn't go to school to take a break. Particularly young girls spoke a lot about school being also a place where they could take a break in some ways from the chores and from the games there, or whether they just went to school to focus on studies. All of that got curtailed to a large extent. And I think our response to what we do is going to be, should correspond to what we have heard. I'm so glad that both Sucheta and Akansha here are here. Most of what we are thinking about Yuva is being guided by what Sucheta has thought through, and Akansha is guiding us through some of it. So pardon both of you. I might have taken what you've told us and made it mine. So clearly, first is that we, first thing for us is going to be that how do we get young people to get back to learning? How do we really enable them, provide that emotional support to them about the questions that are going on in their mind of what is really the impact of these 1.5 years of disruption in their lives, for their careers. If the question is, have I lost forever? Have I gotten, left behind forever? Is that something that we need to deal with first before we start with the learning? Right. So providing that emotional support. Typically,
I'd just like to bring in Kalyan sir here for the moment, who is in Assam and who's the General Secretary, Principal Secretary of Assam, to actually speak about continuing to what Abhishek has spoken about, the barriers that children have faced during the pandemic. Sir, if you could please tell us a little bit from Assam and India.
Yeah, so, well, I would agree with what my co-panelist is saying, that during the course of education, during the pandemic, the first thing that I'll just give you quickly my example. I don't really know how much time I have. But when we were hit with the pandemic for the first time, we didn't, in administration, we couldn't even figure out what it is, because we are dealing with something like about approximately 46,000 schools in the government sector, and all put together about, say, more than 50,000 schools, government and private put together. We're talking about.
So I think we have lost you. You're on mute, sir.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Am I audible now? Yeah, okay. So we were like, initially we were very confused as to what we need to do when we were hit by the pandemic. And of course, my first reaction was like, let's try and teach the kids through WhatsApp. My first reaction. And let me tell you, like, when we talk about education and education of the vast majority of this country are not really connected on internet. They don't really have these kind of mobile devices. And that apart, we also have in the government a system where, the teachers may not like to suddenly transit. So when I tried to ask the teachers, like, let's start teaching on WhatsApp, there was literally a strike against me. In the first 2-3 months, when I asked for the mobile numbers, most of the teachers refused to give me their mobile numbers. I had about 2 lakh teachers. So initially, anyway, we this, and there is this pandemic is not.
I think your internet is patchy, sir. So if I may request you to please switch off the video, that might be better. We could hear you
Yeah.
more clearly.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. So
we can't hear you. So I would suggest we move on to our next panelist, and we'll move back to hear from you a little later. So just a question, and to Akanksha and Sucheta, moving on to both of you. Now, the LinkedIn 2020 report, and we know from what Abhishek has spoken about and Kalyan has spoken about, emotional support is something which is coming as absolutely important. Children had to be resilient. And the 2020 LinkedIn report says the top skills that are emerging are resilience and digital fluency across 7 countries that they have surveyed. And I think I want to make a segue into this section and ask you both 2 questions. One is, when we think about resilience and when we think about digital fluency, we try to think about resilience as a socio-emotional skill and digital fluency as a more 21st century skills. So my question to you is there any difference between socio-emotional learning and 21st century skills? And the second question is, now we see that a lot of data coming in terms of saying that across countries, these skills are emerging as top skills. So do we need to look at these skills from a different perspective from an Indian context? And do we see it from a regional or a local context? How do we see it? Any thoughts on that? Akanksha, if you could go first, and then we'll take Sucheta's response.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Priyanka, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a real delight to be here with all of you. So your first question on, can we look at these skills differently, or are they all in one bucket? Eval Design had hosted a roundtable in 2018 on 21st century skills after we had launched our handbook, and our first opening slide said 21st century skills / life skills / socio-emotional skills. We wanted to get this entire discussion of the difference in this terminology out of the way and actually dive into the matter at hand. So, and I'll give you a couple more examples as to why I think this differentiation is slightly superficial and is not entirely necessary. One is 21st century skills are skills which have been required in all centuries. So it's just, kind of repurposing and repackaging them for the next century. Also, if you look at some of the frameworks, so for example, the P21 framework puts collaboration under learning skills. And the Hilton Pellegrino framework puts collaboration under interpersonal competencies. Now, are you skilled at a competency or you're competent at a skill? It's really hard to debate that, right? So it's very difficult to distinguish those. And another example is, for example, the World Economic Forum talks about initiative as a character quality, whereas the P21 framework talks about initiative as a life skill. So global frameworks are kind of categorizing individual skills into different kinds of buckets. So I think this, at least from the Eval Design standpoint, this differentiation is a little bit unnecessary, but just convenient. I want to throw one more thing into the mix, which is cognitive skills, which is sometimes also used, which is something which coming from a neurobiology background is quite disturbing, because as long as you're awake, everything is cognitive. So I just want to stop there. Sucheta, over to you.
If you could please take the localization or the contextualization of skills bit, and really eager to hear from you what you think of that.
In terms of contextualization, short answer, yes, definitely necessary. Because skills are understood differently in different contexts. And you mentioned resilience as well. Very specifically, actually, one of the studies we did, resilience in different contexts was perceived differently. It is in particularly context of extreme hardships, and Sucheta, you would be an expert in talking to this, resistance is perceived as resilience. So what the perception of a skill is really varies from context to context. And I think we may come to this at a later point, but it has a lot of relevance from the measurement perspective as well. Over to you, Sucheta.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So on the first question, really nothing to add. Fully agree with Akanksha. I think these distinctions don't matter, right? And they do distract from the conversation. So I fully agree with Akanksha on that. To add to the perspective on contextualization, yes, I think we definitely need something that contextualized to India. And I say this from the lens of really the number of children in India living in poverty, right? There are 130 million children living in poverty, and India has the largest number of children who have stunted growth. Now, when you think of stunted growth, you only think of malnutrition and all of that. But what stunted growth also indicates is that your social, cognitive, psychological growth is also stunted. It has also been impacted. So you're not developing and achieving age-appropriate milestones like a child who's coming from a normal background, right? And this is happening because children are growing up in adversity, lack of food, lack of love and care, lack of safe learning spaces. All of this is impacting children's ability to develop like a normal pattern. And that manifests then in the lack of life skills or the lack of social emotional skills. That's how it shows up with the child's inability to solve problems, think critically, respond to challenges. So yes, we do need a very, very contextualized framework for India. While the global understanding of life skills and the frameworks and all is good to take from, but it has to be contextualized. And then of course, once you are in India and the diversity and depending on the geography, the location, the backgrounds that children come from, because life skills itself is very contextual. How we respond to a problem, depends on where you're located geographically, from a place of class, from a place of marginalization, So yes, fully agree with Akanksha. It impacts measurement, but it's also very necessary to contextualize based on where our children are coming from.
Sucheta and Akanksha, just a further add-on question. If you could give an example of how this contextualization can happen, or how you contextualize in your backgrounds or your designs, that would be interesting as well.
Sure, like, see, contextualization is that, right? Like in ours, I can give the example of measurement, which Akanksha brought up. We came up with a life skills assessment scale. Now, when we brought the life skills assessment scale, it was not because there were no other scales available, but all scales of life skills were assuming that children follow a normal pattern, right? That when a child is 5, you can expect these behaviors. When a child turns 12, they can expect this behavior. And this is true. At 3, a child starts talking. At 12, they start interacting with others. When they become teenagers, they start having, they start getting attracted to the opposite gender. This is true of child development. It doesn't matter where children come from. Or where they're growing up in the world. But when you come from adversity, when your development is impacted, this is the pattern that breaks. You're 5 years old, you still don't know how to talk. You're 12 years old, you still don't know how to interact with a teacher, how to interact with peers. You're 15 years old, but you still don't know how to catch a bus, navigate, currency and reach from point A to point B. These are all challenges of development that shows up in our children. So the LSAS was a tool that we developed that specifically is for disadvantaged children. Today being used, in different countries where children come from marginalized backgrounds. But that was kind of how we approached it, where we said, we can't assume a normal pattern of development. So we can't then measure children using normal parameters of age appropriateness. And we need something that takes adversity and it's called failure to thrive, basically, failure to thrive of children into account.
Sure. Thanks, Sucheta and Akanksha. Would you like to add something to it, Akanksha?
Yeah, you're not very clear, Priyanka. I think your voice is a bit faint. But just to, Sucheta, completely agree with you on the contextualization and that being necessary of skills, absolutely. Also, an added step to the nuance of skills is the stages at which they manifest, and also the manifestation of skills is different. If you look at collaboration, for example, collaboration could mean that you're all sitting at the same table and doing your work, as opposed to what some of the Nordic countries see as the highest level of collaboration is everyone is doing work, and at the end of it, no one really knows who's done what, but the job is done. So there is a whole spectrum of collaboration as well, and in certain contexts you would be measuring a certain level of collaboration, and in another context it could be a different level of it. So what the manifestation of a specific skill is, to what degree, what age range, like all of that needs to be contextualized. And again, obviously I will come from a measurement perspective, but yes, context is absolutely essential.
Thank you. So just moving back quickly to my last question, post that we'll move into a second theme of discussion. And I think some bits of it has already come when Akanksha spoke, and Sucheta and Abhishek spoke about how different level of context and these skills are built on top of some of the location, based on the location of the child. So some of our research findings have also been that in some contexts, equity, empathy must also be understood as equity to children. So this is what I want to throw at you, is there a necessity to build on what we already know of these skills and to expand the definitions based on the context? And I think I'll go with Abhishek, and then we'll move to Kalyan sir. Quick round of responses to this.
And do you mind repeating that question for me? I'm sorry, I just want to understand this better. Sorry, Priyanka.
So I think the question is, do we need to expand on what we already know of these skills? For instance, some of our research insights has been that empathy as a skill must also consider equity as something that needs to be taught to children. And one level of understanding can be that the child has to use these skills to tackle adversities. But the second level of understanding could also be that they need to solve for these adversities. So is there any scope of adding to these skills, and how politically can we look at these skills from?
So I'm not an expert at understanding this. So not sure whether I can give you a good answer. But as I said, I think what a very short answer to that from my perspective would be that we definitely need, we definitely don't need to provide answers to the young people, right? I think we will need to help young people discover the solutions to challenges, regardless of the life skills that we're talking about. So agency for them, I think, is going to be something very, very critical, particularly in the context of the pandemic, to find the solutions to their own problem, and do they feel confident about being able to do that? That's how I think about it, but probably the other panelists can tell a little more about it.
Akanksha, and then.
Oh, so the question is, do we need to expand the definition of skills? Yes and no. Sorry for this answer. I think from the measurement perspective, it would be a challenge to expand the definition of skills, because already each skill is made up of a number of sub-constructs, which are fairly complex in and of themselves. Critical thinking, for example, based on 2 years of research that we did, has about 25 sub-skills under that. Right. So yes, we can expand the definition, but that would be an added sub-construct. Also, why would you want to expand the definition of a skill? You could bring in equity as a skill in and of itself, instead, and not have to add it to empathy as part of the package of empathy, right? So purely from the measurement perspective, I don't see the necessity of doing that. It just complicates our lives a lot. But having said that, I completely agree. I think these skills need to evolve over time. What was necessary as a skill in the 18th century may have a different definition. As I mentioned, I talked about collaboration. It looks different in different time points and manifests itself differently. So there needs to be an evolution of definitions of skills, but not just for the sake of it. Also, I think to talking to your question about the politicization of life skills, that's a really interesting question. I haven't had that in any other discussion before, but yes, I completely agree with that. The reason is, if you look at two skills, for example, critical thinking and empathy together, critical thinking is absolutely essential for you to be involved as a citizen of any country. Empathy is also essential, and I can give like a very stark example. If a child from a privileged background is in a chauffeur-driven car on the street, and there's another child on the street, if this child does not have both empathy and critical thinking to question why is that child in a different situation from me, and have the empathy to relate to it, change is not going to happen. So yes, skills definitely are required for being a good citizen, and therefore it talks to the political angle of it as well.
So just a bit, and I think I'm going to take an answer from you quickly on that as well. But if we can quickly move on to Kalyan, sir, we had lost you. If you can come back.
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
I was listening.
So just a
couple of
little
things
bit
I
of
would like to say.
I'm sorry, sir.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
It's more like compliance, like it's monitoring, discipline, completing of the portions in time. So basically, and it's not really technology flexible, though of course we are trying to bring in ICT technology right now. So these are things which are still in the realm of academics. It's not yet filtered down to school education as of now. Of course, NEP, the new education policy, talks about redefining the way portions are constructed, reconstructing the curriculum, giving more amount of reconstructing the report card of children. In the sense, we have now a holistic report card, which we trying to say that this much only is for academics. And so actually putting these things into practice is will be the game changer. So when we're talking about these skills, like whether it's critical thinking or creativity or collaboration, communication or technology. So of all these things, I think what is most necessary today, I think I would restrict myself to two things. One is, as the one co-panelist says, that kids are by nature, they are, extremely creative, and they extremely they would like to do problem solving, which we restrict by, excessive discipline. Second thing I think is the need for equity and social skills. There's too much of disharmony and disunity in society today. And there is a great need, and there's a concept of value education which is never there. So great need to bring in social skills and empathy into school education. I think these two things, if you go around the world also, you talk about disharmony, you talk about wars, you talk about conflict, you talk about conflict.
I think you brought some great points, but we have lost you again. So I will come back to you. Meanwhile, some great points there in terms of what kind of subjectivity do we need to be introduced in schools. But starting off on an idea of systems change, and Sir Kalyan sir actually brought some very interesting points on that as to what academic outcomes are prioritized, and we're still looking at discipline. And I think quickly going to you, Sucheta, and you have introduced happiness curriculum. You've been part of it. So what has been your experience, and what changes have you seen, or the challenges, or what's enabled you to change how the teachers or the schools, the traditional schools, have taken this up?
Sure. For me, the happiness curriculum is a live example of political will, right? That's really where it all starts for me for large scale change. When you really want to create large scale mindset shift about, what is the purpose of education? What can you expect from your elected leaders? You were talking, I had some things to add on the politics of it also. But when we think about how, what we expect from our political leaders, from our elected leaders, that is for me the heart of, how the happiness curriculum came about. It came about through a series of different reforms that happened before happiness was introduced in terms of infrastructure, teacher capacity building, trust building, right? All of that happened. And then happiness was introduced, and it has continued to build with now the new Delhi board and all of that. So happiness for me sits in that context of completely reimagining education, completely reimagining the purpose of it, and really making children ready for this crazy, unpredictable future that they are entering into. So if your question is what made that possible, it's political will. And that's what
you would really prioritize, political will. I'd just like to bring in Abhishek here for a bit. And I know you've had a very different approach to systems change. We rather think about it mostly in institutionalized sense. So Abhishek, if you could just tell us a bit about your work and how have you imagined systems change?
Thanks, Priyanka, again. So let me talk about first maybe a little bit of theory, but I think what would make it interesting is to give an example to talk about the theory of change. As Yuva, we basically, if we do exist, we exist primarily to bring young people at the center of the stage, really. So what does that mean is that you give them space to form and express their views. You give them voice to be able to express views in the way that's best suitable to them, but also in a way that they will listen. And finally, space and voice probably may not be sufficient, so you give them an audience as well, so that relevant stakeholders will listen and consider their views seriously. Now, for that to happen, obviously, you need a few more things. So you don't look at young people at in the silos of, okay, so if you are below 14, you go to a primary school that is done by some different ministry, 14 to 18 adolescent. This goes to another ministry, and then 18 to 24 to someone else. Young people need to be seen as young people between 10 and 24 with a seamless transition. So as Yuva, how can we look at the holistic take a holistic view of the problem, really handhold every young person from the moment she turns 10 until she is 24, and really taking them through various stages in their life of making a successful career in their lives. And in the process, looking at the white spaces, missing interlinkages, solving for them, building multi-sector partnerships, enabling collaborative action, etc. To sort of give you a quick example, and particularly since both Akansha and Sucheta is here, I was referring to Young Warrior program that we had done on the COVID, and we started looking at, could we do Young Warrior Next, which would focus on the educational response. So now this program is anchored by Yuva, but led by Michael and Susan Dell Foundation, Udyam Foundation, Dream a Dream, Eval Design are supporting through working groups. More than 20 organizations have come together to look at how can we reach 5 million young people in a year's time with the life skills. And really the Yuva is playing a role of a secretariat that enables people to come together, diverse stakeholders from government to everyone come together, look at delivery at scale, and most importantly, crowding in capital. So that because capital moves the world in some ways, so how do we crowd in capital to then make us get to a scale very, very quickly? So that's how we look at the systems change at this point.
Sure. Thanks, Abhishek. And I think it's interesting that you brought some interesting points of how to reach the learners. Akanksha, quickly from you, any thoughts on systems change? And also, and I think this question I really want to ask you is on assessments, and if how assessments are introduced in skills, and do you think that might change how the system prioritizes these skills? And I think I'm clubbing these questions, but I leave it to you to take it
Okay.
as you like.
So the latter first, I think I just made a comment in the chat, the measure to treasure. So yes, measurement definitely does drive, because if you don't know, you're not going to try and even make change. And I think Asar is a great example, although given, the political aspect of it is, I'm not going to touch upon it, but it has definitely driven the conversation on the quality of foundational skills. So measurement is definitely important to drive change. On the systems part of it, I think I'll put a slightly different spin to it. So interestingly, I have been doing some work on systems thinking lately. And systems approaches are a very interesting way of understanding what is really going on. It takes you away, and these are kind of theoretical methods. They take you away from your traditional, log frames of input, output, outcome, and impact. What it does is it forces you to think in 3 dimensions at the same time. And what we've done is recently we've collated a whole bunch of education technology frameworks, put them together and analyze them using systems analysis methods. What we find is something which is not visible in the usual qualitative analysis, coding, etc. methods that we use, is we plotted this as a network graph, and we see that employers are very central in this system to drive change. They are a fairly influential factor, and this was not at all visible through the rest of the analysis doing it traditionally. So if you can find these leverage points through a new way of thinking, a systems way of doing research, these can actually be leveraged. So if you look at employers, for example, they are the one connection to accreditation bodies in this network graph that we have plotted. And how that can impact the system is if there is a demand from employers for a certain skill set, accreditation bodies can therefore start catering to that demand as well. And they are then the drivers of changing the whole system. So the first thing is to then look at, the system as a whole, step away from traditional approaches and think in newer ways, and then try and find the leverage points. So this is one way of looking at it from a top-down approach. But on the other hand, I'm shifting a little bit away from EdTech because this research has been done on that, is also looking at bottom-up change. So there is disruptive innovation happening in EdTech. The demand and supply is entirely driven by who's creating and who is buying the stuff. And you do not have the government bodies involved in this picture except as regulators. So, but they are driving a lot of disruption in what is going on. So there is top down as well as bottom up disruption at the system level. Both of that needs to happen in tandem. But also, if we think of newer ways of analyzing it, I think we can come up with newer insights and push things a little faster.
I think Kalyan sir, could I please have you back?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. Sir, your solutions, and I know you brought up some
Ma'am,
very interesting.
what was the question, ma'am? Actually, I was in conversation with my minister. Can you just tell me what was the question?
Sure, sir. So the kind of challenges that you have brought about, sir, for an education system, as to what are the challenges that they face to prioritize 21st century skills here. What, according to you, can be a solution to bring these skills to central focus in the school systems?
So, I mean, so basically, see, till now, the focus, I think, of school education or college education has been basically on infrastructure, teachers. It's not been child-centric till now. So, so the biggest change that probably would be required is to defocus so much on infrastructure and to focus on the child and see the medium to get to the child is the teacher. And what I see is that the teachers are basically sometimes mostly indifferent, or they are not really up to the mark as far as teaching is concerned. So one is, of course, the key thing is to develop systems by which teachers upgrade their skills and they are accountable to what they teach. So that's, I think, one big challenge that I have and I probably will try and address is how to make the teachers accountable to the child. The second thing is, of course, the kind of curriculum that we had was so like colonial almost. So it to be made dynamic and to be made more interesting. That would be something, to just give the, when most of the times children read things which are completely unnecessary. So really, like, they may not even, after passing out from class 10, what is it that they retain? Very little. So we got to focus on the basics. We got to have a very clear idea as to what kind of curriculum we have. I have a very interesting, I mean, live example that I have and like to share with you. Like when I passed out from IIT Madras, we had 95% of us going into non-engineering jobs. In fact, somebody who was really at the bottom of the class now is the professor emeritus in IIT Madras, because he was the only one who actually went about designing things after passing out from IIT. In the sense, he made gears, he made what is that? He made the rural ATMs. He became the scientific advisor to the Prime Minister. It's because of the thing that it was a hands-on kind of thing he did with his hands. So education has to be practical. It cannot be like in books. So more focus on doing things, bagless days, internships, children going out and experimenting with what concepts they have. I think that, refocusing on the curriculum, refocusing on how the teachers teach, I think will be the most important thing. And those things will bring in, these kind of life skills that you're talking about. And I said, like, children understanding each other. For example, inclusive education. Parents look at it as a big hurdle if, like, a child with disabilities comes to the school. So there's tremendous degree of understanding that is required. This gender parity is required, inclusive education and social equity. So if we focus on these 4 or 5 things, I think it will make a big difference to education. Yeah. Thanks.
Coming back to bringing these skills and putting this back into focus. And thank you, sir, for bringing some very eminent points. You spoke about teacher accountability, capacity, and I think we've been having some discussions around that in our previous panels as well. So just coming back to this particular point, and Sucheta, this is for you, and I know you've spoken about, we don't really need to have these skills, but more in terms of, we know that from our research, that creativity is really understood as only something which is needed for artistic careers. That's a common understanding in the system. We also know that perhaps the teachers, as one way is teacher capacity, but also the teacher is heavily burdened. So just putting this question back to you, so to just build that definition of clarity. So what are your ways you could bring this into the schools? And yeah.
You're asking me?
So do you have any response, sir, for this? So I was just building on your question.
Yeah, okay. So I didn't know whether you were asking me the question. Okay. So you're saying that how do I go about getting this into schools?
Sure.
Yeah. What is the process by which I try to get these things into school, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So right now, see, till now, I know it's an uphill task, but I can tell you, for example, to make teachers accountable, we have now systems in place. Like, for example, the teacher has to take a test. Under NISHTA also, the Government of India, they have to take a test, and we will really rate them. And they would be rated as good teachers, average teachers, or below average, or like teachers who cannot go and teach, based on the percentage of marks they get in the test, in a digital test that we are going to conduct from this year. So that is one in terms of teacher capability. So we will have the questions which are set in a manner in which we will make them more, hopefully, we will make them more creative in terms of their pedagogy. Now, in terms of accountability, obviously, the accountability will be in terms of how the children perform. So if the children are not performing, the performance of the children would be taken as accountability for the teachers. Whether we can link it up to their pay bands, etc., is something that I am exploring. It's a tough call because teachers are a very, very powerful community. So, but if the students are not performing, quite definitely the blame goes to the teachers, because most of the children are virgin material, which could actually be molded into being intelligent or not, depends on the kind of teaching that happens. So the performance of the student, now of course we don't have so much money, but we introduced something called as personalized adaptive learning systems, which I am sure that you're all practicing, putting into practice. But in government schools, it's a very expensive proposition, wherein a child actually answers questions on each subject, and then we get to know how much he's learned, and that automatically gets recorded into our database. We are doing an experiment in about 1,000 schools with regard to personalized adaptive learning systems, by which I know exactly how a child is performing. So I have a methodology of making teachers accountable. I have a methodology of upgrading the knowledge and skills of the teacher. So we have also designed, as I told you, we have changed the report card. And we have said that, and this is also a digital report card, where they have to not just take the height, weight, and whether the student has got, whether he's been tested and given vitamins. We are also going to check as to how much of sports activities he was involved in, and besides, of course, the academics. So the overall process of judging how a child is doing, we're putting these into practice this time. Only time will tell as to how they will pan out. There will be a lot of political opposition with regard to making teachers accountable. We will see. Anyway, because of COVID, we have not made it so strict, but we will see how the thing rolls out with time. Yeah.
One of the things that came out from the last panels was that, perhaps the teacher is alienated in the system. Just to hold that thought there, Akanksha, you had your hand raised.
Yes, I was wondering if I could go a little bit off script and have a counter question for Mr. Kalyan Chakravarti. Given that there's a lot of progressive work that you've been doing, how are you thinking about the accountability for 21st century skills or life skills, given the difficulty in measurement and the resource intensiveness, and also the fact that they cannot necessarily be measured well through traditional pen and paper tests?
We are talking about teachers or about teachers?
I mean, accountability would come through measurement. So very specifically in terms of measuring 21st century skills at that scale, how were you thinking about it?
So as I said, obviously the measurement has to be for all the children. What happens in a classroom, I mean, this has been told and I have seen in my little experience of this 1.5 to 2 years, is that only whenever we go to a classroom, the teacher shows the best child. And like basically half the class perhaps does not even understand the subject or really cannot go from that chapter to the next chapter. And therefore, as I said, that the best way of doing this measurement is through a personalized adaptive learning system, which is a digital mode. Like, see, in Assam, we are trying to give, completely populate or saturate it with digital devices and smart classrooms. We are hoping to at least in class 9, 10, 11, 12, we are saturating. At the lower levels, we are trying to give, first school some tabs so that, they are able to, they rotated between the classes. We will be testing we are hoping to test the children. We are already piloted it in, as I told you, in 1,000 schools. We're hoping to test the children chapter to chapter through through the personalized adaptive, which is an artificial intelligence module. You immediately know when you're answering questions on a particular subject as to how much you've learned, and the child's data and how he's performing chapter wise is analyzed. So we have a dashboard on which we know school wise which child is performing how well on a particular chapter, and then we will know exactly what is the overall performance of the child. And it's a good enough tool for the administrators at the cluster level, at the block level, to see as to how a teacher is performing, how many students are doing well, doing badly, in which chapters they're doing badly. Of course.
So we've lost you again. Just a quick question for you. We run almost close to close time now. Sucheta, to you is, and you'd spoken about political will and that being the top enabling factor. But then also like definitional clarity and some of the problems that, some of the challenges that Kalyan sir had brought in as well. So how do you see that kind of challenges in terms of just definitional clarity in teachers or in terms of time constraint? How do you look at addressing those, or how have you addressed those?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, there was a question in the chat also that just putting the onus on teachers, I'm not fully bought into that idea that it's only teachers who must be accountable. I think there's accountability across the board. And that's really what happened with happiness curriculum, right? There was a political will to say we'll take 5 minutes out of every class and create a new 40-minute class in the school calendar. That takes courage to do that and say that this is important enough to prioritize it, and then invest in teacher training, right? And then invest in handbooks, then put that whole machinery in place for that to actually roll out. And then, of course, you need to build teacher capacity. And there's a whole other conversation around how do you change teacher mindsets from a more didactic, information-giving role to a more facilitative role. But I think it's a combination of all of this. We just can't say teacher capacity building will solve it. It has to be starting from the education minister and the political class to the administration class to SCRT in every state to teacher training diets, then teachers, parents, and then the child. So it has to be a shift across the entire system. Only then is this possible. And to add to that, there's another also in the chat conversation that we also need to look at this just beyond one class, right? We must reimagine what is the purpose of education today in this complex, unpredictable world, and then put political will behind that. So again, while I'm a huge proponent of happiness curriculum, I'm more excited by the fact that we're bringing in a new education board, the whole new NEP that is coming up, which is expanding the idea of life skills in 21st century beyond just a class to really reimagining the purpose of education. So there I fully agree with Kalyan sir on the way forward.
I think that's a great point to end this discussion. And I'd request if you could send us your, type in your email IDs for any of the audience, if they want to reach out to you with particular questions that they would like to address to you. And if that's a possibility, please, I would like you to address this. Quickly ask Sweetie now to speak a little about the research that H.T. Parekh Foundation has brought about and the kind of collaborations that she sees that is necessary in this space. Over to you, Sweetie, and thank you to all the panelists for joining in. And I think I had an absolute great time speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Priyanka. And truly, it was, I think, a very, very insightful conversation we had. And I think one hour was probably not enough because there was just so many things that did come out of this discussion, very, very different perspectives. So I just want to kind of step back and say that when we started this project with Quest, we had started from the point of just getting definitional clarity on what 21st century skills really are, because that was an area that we were looking to invest in and support. So that's where we started. That was our starting point. But then, three key things happened. The NEP came out. This exact topic became front and center for what education was going to look like and where we see education heading. COVID happened. Everything that we knew to be, the cornerstones of school education completely was thrown out of the window. And job markets, again, completely different requirements of what skills were required when a child enters the workspace. And it was great for us to also know that our research was addressing each of these kind of components, understanding really the key 21st century skills that are required. Secondly, how do you inculcate it into school education? And third, how does that ensure that children are ready for the transition that they're making into workspaces, and what is, and I think Akanksha spoke about it, that the employer becomes front and center for certain prioritization of some of the skills. So that's essentially what this research has captured and structured itself around. And what really came out for us, and what we are taking away from it, is that there are a lot of fragmented kind of interventions where programs are addressing life skills, and they essentially then kind of aren't able to sustain. And that's where the systems change approach is what is really required. And I think we are coming in at a time where the political will and the need is very, very stark and apparent. So for us, the hope is to really identify a kind of an environment which is able to take in and support the integration of 21st century skills, not as a separate, standalone thing that you're doing in a classroom, but which is really intrinsic to what education is, because that is required for our students to be prepared for the time ahead. So we're really looking forward to kind of bringing this out, sharing it with all the stakeholders who could kind of gather insights from it and operationalize it, because that was our intention as well when we commissioned or when we partnered on this research. And really excited as this report comes out in a couple of in some time to really kind of take this dialogue forward, which is what we've just kind of touched upon today. So really excited about that.
Thank you, Sweetie. And thank you all the panelists, Sucheta, Abhishek, Akanksha, Kalyan sir. Really look forward to having more conversations. Thank you all.